I think we'll start. I'll start now. Welcome, everyone. We are really excited to be presenting this college timeline, nuts and bolts for teens with IEPs and Section 504 plans with Janine Kelly and Deborah List. Janine is a special ed advocate who has been supporting children with disabilities and their families for over 12 years, advising them on all aspects of the IEP and Section 504 process and how to prepare for post-secondary school transitions. Deborah, a former university professor and student advisor, lectures on student accessibility, mental health, and disability needs. They're partners in College Access and Beyond, which supports students and their families as they plan for their futures beyond high school. On the information page on our website, www.spednetwilton.org, there is, aside from information and about them and the complete presentation, there's a lot of information about college planning resources that they've posted. So feel free to access that afterwards. A number of things are coming up that we're doing a push on the college process. So still in March, after this presentation, there is going to be on Tuesday, March 22nd, Colleges with Support Services for Students with Disabilities, which is a panel discussion webinar brought by Darianne and SpedNet, with representatives from the University of Maryland, Hobart and William Smith College, Sacred Heart University, Hofstra, and College Steps. And after that, at the end of March, we will be having Mary Murphy on March 30th, talking about executive function skills your teen needs before graduating from high school. So all three of those programs will work very well together. A few things, all information that's given today is for educational purposes only. We will be taking questions after they're finished today. So please do us a favor and type your questions into the Q&A and not into the chat. Someone is asking if you're automatically muted. Yes. So nothing more into the chat, please. It's very hard for us to be looking at everything all together. This presentation is brought to you by Wilton Public Schools, Wilton Library, and Newtown Sped PTA, as well as presented by SpedNet. I am Eve Kessler, Executive Director of SpedNet, and Janine is also one of our co-presidents. Andrea Sato from the Wilton Library is here, and she is going to give a short welcome to everyone, and then we'll begin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eve, for including me on behalf of the Wilton Library. We're so pleased to be a part of this very interesting and important webinar. And we are so glad to continue our partnership with SpedNet Wilton, the Wilton Public Schools, and in this case, Newtown Sped PTA. So with that, just enjoy the webinar, make it useful for you, and I'll turn it over to Janine, I think.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eve and Andrea, for that introduction. It's so nice to be here with everyone. It's actually kind of weird to be on the other side of the webinar. I'm normally the one who introduces the speakers, but today I'm really happy to be here with my partner, Deborah List, to discuss the college timeline, nuts and bolts for teens with IEPs and 504 plans. We hope to talk to you today about the things you can do to help your student with disabilities have a smooth transition from high school to college, if that's the path that they choose. And I'm referring to students with disabilities. I'm meaning students who have learning needs, students who have learning differences, students who have special needs. I use the term disabilities because that is how it's referred to in the law. Just going to start my timer here to make sure that I give everyone a chance to talk. And just a footnote here, this webinar through the Zoom platform is not set up for closed captioning. And I'm mentioning this only because later on in the discussion, Deborah will be talking about accommodations and accessibility. And if your student is going to need closed captioning at the college level, you're going to make sure that they specifically request that webinars have that feature. So I just wanted to make a note of that for you. So what are our goals for today? First of all, no student is 100% ready to transition from high school to college. So keep that in mind. College is really intended to be a place where the student continues to grow and develop and pursue their passions. For our students with disabilities, they work twice as hard typically academically and socially as their typical peers. And so the more we can help them develop in terms of their college readiness skills before they get to college, the easier their transition will be. So today we hope to identify college readiness skills, what skills students should be developing in middle school and high school. We hope to explain whether a student should self-identify as a student with disabilities once they get to college. We will describe tips on how to select a college or university that's the right tip for your student, that's the right fit for your student. And we will illustrate the accommodations process in higher education and what accommodations might look like at the college level. We'll also discuss what your role is as a parent in that transition process. So who are we? So Eve had a very nice introduction. I am a former litigation attorney, and I also have 3 children. And when my second child was born with medical issues and then ultimately an autism diagnosis, I left the practice of law to raise my 3 children. And then when the time was right, I entered back into the workforce and dedicated my career to supporting students with disabilities and their families as they navigate the special education process from pre-K through post-high school transition. I also now have 2 college-age sons. One is my student who was formerly diagnosed with autism. He has actually since lost that autism diagnosis, but he's now in college. And Deborah?
As Eve indicated, I've worked in higher education as a professor, a student advisor, and have sat on accessibility and student success committees in universities for over the last 15 years. My professional graduate training is in public health, which is primarily a population and social justice perspective on looking at access to care for children with disabilities. And my doctoral work in this area was focused on children with chronic illness and access to care. Additionally, I am the parent of a child with a life-threatening medical condition who has an IEP, and he is a senior at Wilton High School. So I have just gone through the college application process with him. I also have 2 other children who are in high school.
So helping our students transition from high school to college. Really what this involves, first and foremost, is a change in our mindset. It involves a change in the way we look at the college process and what we look at college in terms of what its purpose is for our students. We really need to, as parents, start to move away from that idea that our students attending the best college is critical to their success later in life. For all students, but especially for our students with disabilities, we really want to make sure that we're thinking about what college would be the right fit for them. Not necessarily the best college on their college list or one of the top 10 colleges or the top 25, but what college is going to be the place where they feel competent as a student, where they feel that they're supported, and where they are able to pursue their passions and their interests and excel in what they do well. So just keep in mind that best during the college search process doesn't necessarily mean that that best college is what's right for your student. And if they're accepted to that best college, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be successful there. Finding the right fit college really is a very individualized process that depends on the student's strengths and the student's areas of need. So understanding the student. This may seem like common sense, but it's really critical in terms of helping your student find that right fit college and helping them to have a successful transition from high school to college. So we really want to make sure that not only do we understand our student as a learner, but that we're helping them to understand themselves. So how do they learn best? What do they want to do in life? What are their short and long-term goals? What are their strengths and interests? What are their weaknesses and needs? Do they even want to go to college? Do they understand the commitment of college and what that will entail for them? A student has to want to go to college in order to be successful. So that's really a critical step in the thought process. But you want their high school career to really allow them to focus on what their strengths are, where the areas are that they do well in, and allow them to take classes in high school that they excel in, that they're interested in. Also, you obviously want to continue to work on those areas of interest, those areas of need, but make sure that you're focusing on the positive in terms of what they do well. So college readiness skills, what do they look like? I've listed them here, and this is not an all-inclusive list, but these are very important skills that they should be developing in middle school and high school in order to successfully transition to college. But no student will have developed all of these skills to the point of mastery by the time they go on to college. I've listed them here so that you can use this list to have discussions with your school team and your students' teachers, and to also have discussions with your student about not only where they may be having difficulty throughout high school, but where are their strengths? Where are the areas that they're excelling in? And where are the areas that they need continued work in high school and maybe even in college? So language arts. Obviously, can the student read, explain, and understand their own thoughts as well as the thoughts of others? Can they write them down? And are they able to objectively analyze and evaluate issues in order to form an expressive opinion? So these are what we call critical thinking skills. And again, not every student is going to have developed critical thinking skills to the point of mastery before they get to college. Problem solving is also a critical skill. Can they analyze and communicate a problem? Can they research and create solutions independently? Are they able to depend on others? Can they make a decision on their own and in a group? And are they able to work collaboratively with others? Note-taking is an important skill to develop before they transition onto college, and obviously research and writing skills. And I've noted here citation skills because plagiarism is something that's taken very seriously in college, and even an innocent mistake in a citation in a college paper can lead to a plagiarism charge. So you want to make sure in high school that your student is not only working on those research and writing skills, but also learning how to appropriately cite their sources in their work. So again, as you're working through these skills, as they're developing them in middle school and especially in high school, you're going to want to note whether the student is struggling in any of these areas, and you're going to use that information in your quest to find the right college. So for example, if a student struggles with the language arts skills, that reading comprehension and that critical thinking, that student may not necessarily feel competent at a liberal arts college. You may want to instead look for colleges that have freshman writing courses. Many schools offer freshman writing 101 as part of their freshman curriculum. Many schools also offer writing tutors that a student can access if they're having difficulty at the college level. And then look for a course of study at the college level that does not necessarily involve intensive reading and writing. A liberal arts college is going to involve intensive work in critical thinking. So again, if a student is struggling in those areas, you may not want to necessarily look at those colleges. Executive function skills. So this is also an area that a student should really focus on in high school in terms of developing independent work skills. Deborah loves to say, show me a student who does not need executive function support. And this is absolutely true. Every student can use executive function support in high school and in college. And I would say that executive function skills are just as important at the college level as the academic readiness skills. A student in high school may be getting straight A's, and that does not necessarily translate to success at the college level if the student is achieving those grades through modifications and accommodations. The key really here is to determine how independent the student is in their work, and help them to become as independent as possible before they transition on to college. So are they able to set their own goals? Can they organize their work as well as their materials? How are they at planning their short and long-term projects? Can they manage their time on their own? Do they have appropriate self-control skills in terms of regulating their emotions and also regulating their levels of anxiety? Do they have independent study skills? I've noted this as important here because one of the accommodations that we typically see in high school is teacher-generated study guides. And this is an accommodation that will not be provided to them in college. So it's really important for the student in high school to begin to learn how to formulate their own study guides in studying for tests. And then again, note-taking skills is also an important skill to develop while they're in high school. Deborah will talk later about accommodations that can be provided if the student does struggle with that. The good news is that many colleges recognize that the key to success for a student in college is to have strong executive function skills. So many colleges are now offering, as part of their freshman curriculum, freshman executive function courses that are built into the course of study their freshman year. And many colleges also offer separate programs where a student can receive executive function support either in a private pay program where they would pay separately, or as part of what the college offers to all students. So if your student struggles with executive function skills, make sure you're checking to see whether they're offering a course during the freshman year or whether they offer a separate program that will allow that student to be supported with their executive function skills. So independence and life skills. Again, this may seem like common sense, but we all exist in the world of helicopter parents. I myself am just as guilty. So a lot of these skills we really should be helping our students develop before they leave us. College is going to be challenging enough for them academically and socially when they transition, especially for our students with disabilities. So keep in mind that the supports we're giving them at home and at school are not necessarily going to be provided once they get to college. And in fact, once the student turns 18, our role as a parent legally changes for them in terms of their education and in terms of their medical care, and I'll discuss that a little bit later. But we really want to make sure that our student is becoming as independent as possible and that we're fading our parental role before they transition on to college. And I would say really the most important skill here on this list is self-advocacy. Can the student make decisions on their own? Can they explain their strengths and needs to an individual in a way that's understandable? Do they understand their rights and responsibilities as a student? Can they ask for help? And also that applies in an academic setting, but also in a medical care setting. Can they explain their medical needs in a way that's understood? Can they advocate for themselves? Because you're not going to be there advocating for them. And then self-care is also very important. What are their eating and sleeping habits like? Are they able to get up on their own and make it to class on time? Can they manage their anxiety productively? Do they have a good way of managing their stress? Are they able to follow a treatment plan on their own if they're sick? These are all skills that really they should be developing in high school before they transition on to college. So how do we help them build these skills? So first of all, it's important to work with your school team in middle school and in high school. And especially in high school, you're going to want to make sure that you're working with your school team to set goals that will address a lot of these skills that they'll need in college. Make sure that your team is focusing not only on areas of need, but also, as we indicated earlier, on areas of strength. Again, allow for the planning for courses that focus on what they enjoy and what they do well. Also set goals so that they can develop in those areas of weakness. Make sure that you include a goal for self-awareness and self-advocacy. Build a plan that encourages independence. In other words, as the student is progressing in high school, try to start to fade those accommodations as much as possible and allow them to begin to work independently. Once the student enters high school, make sure that all modifications are completely removed. And Deborah's going to go into more depth about this later in terms of the differences between modifications and accommodations. But modifications of curriculum will not be granted at the college level. So if a student has curriculum modifications in their plan, make sure that those are faded once they hit high school if they plan to attend college. And really put the burden on your student to begin to take ownership of their work in high school. Have your student work with guidance on what their graduation requirements are going to be, on what admission requirements are going to be at the colleges that they're looking at, and on whether or not they need SAT and ACT accommodations. And also encourage your student to work with guidance independently on their course selections as well. And just keep in mind that IEPs and 504 plans do not transfer to college with the student. In fact, an IEP will end as soon as the student graduates or turns 22 in the state of Connecticut. And 504 plans, you will basically have to start over again at the college level and reapply for those accommodations. You're not necessarily going to get the same accommodations that you got in high school once you reach college. So how you can help them at home, practice those independent skills anywhere and everywhere. Teach life skills that they can use once they get to college, how to do laundry, how to cook, how to navigate public transportation. Allow for independent problem solving wherever possible, help them to learn from their mistakes, talk to them about their strengths often, help them understand their needs and be able to explain them, and help them understand what accommodations actually help them to learn. And then if you feel as you're going along in high school that your student may not necessarily be ready to transition right to college from high school, consider a transition program or a gap year. One of the gifts of COVID has been the gift of time. And many students, for a variety of reasons, have taken time off for either 1 or 2 years in the past 2 years since COVID. So taking a gap year has actually become socially acceptable. And there are many, many programs now out there, transition programs that your student can enroll in before they go to college that will help them continue to develop these skills so that they can be ready when they hit the ground running. And this is one of my favorite slides. Many of you may not be aware, Michael Jordan actually has ADHD. And one of his most famous quotes is, "I have failed over and over again in my life, and that is why I succeed." Allow your student to fail. I know that's really counterintuitive for us as parents. We don't want our kids to fail. We want them to be successful. We don't want them to suffer the pain of failure, but it's really important that they learn how to fail and that they learn how to pick themselves up and start again. So let them fail and let them learn. So whether or not a student should self-identify as a student with disabilities. Now, in this context, I'm talking about self-identifying once they've enrolled in their college of choice. Keep in mind that there's absolutely no harm in reaching out to the accessibility office during your college search or during the application process. In fact, I would say it's advisable. I would say it's necessary. You really need to start talking to the accessibility office while you're searching for those colleges so that you can determine whether that college is going to be able to provide the appropriate supports that your student might need. And the accessibility office at the college that you're looking at is not going to pick up the phone and call the admissions office to let them know that your student stopped by to talk about their disabilities. It just doesn't happen. So unless during the application process, your student is writing about their disability in their college essay, or unless their guidance counselor refers to their disability with the student's permission in their recommendations, the college is not going to find out that your student has a disability. There's not a box on the application that you're going to be checking to let the college know that they have a disability. But once you're actually enrolled in the college, I think it's really important, and I usually advise my students to self-identify as a student that has disabilities, to register with the accessibility office, and to apply for those accommodations that they think they might need, even if ultimately they're not going to use them. And the reason why is because once you're sort of locked in to that process at the college level, you have access to whatever disability resources the accessibility office has. You can tap into the supportive environment. You can begin to build relationships with the people in the accessibility office. You can reach out to faculty and explain to them why you might need certain accommodations and how you learn, and you can basically be set up for success. Again, even if you ultimately decide that you don't need those accommodations, it's good to have them set up ahead of time. And by the way, the process is confidential, so other students are not going to find out that your student has a disability at the college level. Just turning off my alarm here. Oops, sorry about that. Don't want to make anyone nauseous. And then the cons, obviously, to not self-identifying is that you're basically on your own when you get to college. What if you decide halfway through a semester that you really should have registered for those accommodations, and maybe you're not doing as well as you expected? Maybe you're failing a class and you realize that if you had had those accommodations, you might have actually done better. It might be too, even though you can still apply late in the semester for those accommodations, the accommodations are not going to be retroactive, and it might be too late to change the ultimate course of, to change the ultimate outcome of the course. So in other words, if you're failing a class and you apply for those accommodations late, it may not change the result. You may still wind up failing the class. So again, I think it's really important to get the student set up for success, to make sure that they're registered with that accessibility office before they start college, even if they decide they're not going to use those accommodations. And then what documentation is necessary to basically show proof to the accessibility office that your student has a disability? So you want to check with the college website. Every college is different in terms of what documentation they require, and the accessibility tab at each college can be very specific about what they're looking for. But I'll give you some examples. So, for example, a learning disability. The college may require a psychological educational evaluation that's completed within 1 to 2 years before enrollment, and also a statement of functional impact in learning and living by a qualified professional. What that means is the person who diagnosed your student is also going to have to describe how that disability impacts their learning and why certain accommodations are necessary. The student may also be asked to fill out a questionnaire and basically self-advocate for why they need certain accommodations and how their disability affects their learning. Similarly, for a student who might have a medical disability, the college may require medical records or a medical summary of the student's medical disability, and also, again, a statement of functional impact on living and learning. And then for all students, here's what I referred to earlier in terms of how our role changes as a parent once the student turns 18. When the student turns 18 and goes on to college, we no longer have access to their educational records. Their educational records and their privacy is protected by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. So we cannot access their student portal or their grades or whether their tuitions are getting paid on time without the student's permission. So we want to make sure when the student transitions to college that they sign a FERPA waiver that's on file with the college so that we can actually access that information. The FERPA waiver is not going to allow you to pick up the phone and call a professor or an accommodations officer. In fact, most professors and most accommodation staff will not talk to you on the phone unless your student is there. And in many cases, they won't talk to you anyway. But it will at least allow you to access grades and whether tuition payments are being made on time. And then again, a power of attorney for healthcare is going to be very necessary if you want to be involved in your student's medical care, because once they turn 18, you're no longer involved. So many states require the student to fill out a power of attorney, granting you to be involved in their medical care in the state where they're enrolled in college and also in the state of their primary residence. Oops. So that's it for my part of the presentation. I hope I've provided helpful information on college readiness skills and how your students can use the skills that they have to determine the right fit college. And Deborah will now discuss accessibility and what accommodations might look like at the college level. Deborah, the mic is yours. Deborah, you're unmuted.
There we go. We're having technology issues here.
There we
All
go.
right, thank you, Janine.
I'll mute
Janine's
myself
still going to
now.
be in charge of the slides, so we'll see if we can make this work. So I'm going to start with an overview of what you want to look for at a college and university when you're sort of beginning this process. You want to really be on a path to choosing a school where your student can thrive, as Janine sort of mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So you want to think about your students' strengths and where is a place where they can thrive and be most happy and most successful. So one of the places I really recommend that you start is just looking at the website at the schools that you're interested in. There's so much information you can find out about a school by looking at their website. What kind of a culture does the school have? Can you actually find the accessibility office on their website? Is it hidden, or is it really easy to find? Is it within student life services, or is it within the DEI section of the university? These are things that will give you a sense of where they sort of think about accessibility, how important it is, how easy it is for the incoming families to find the information they need about accessibility. Another thing to do is to take a look at different reviews in books and online about the accessibility standards at different schools. There's lots of information out there. There's parent perspective, there's student perspective on all sorts of different websites about this information, depending on what your students' needs are and what their strengths are. So what type of a program are you looking for? What types of things would be most supportive to your student? And just taking a look at what's out there and what other families and students have sort of said or rated about those different types of programs. Something to think about is to have an initial conversation with the accessibility office before even submitting an application. That's a very telling type of conversation. For example, a school may not be willing to talk to applicants before a student is admitted. Right there, that should be a really big red flag to you. If a school is not willing to have a conversation with students before they're admitted, that might tell you that the school really isn't putting accessibility and meeting with your student and understanding their needs prior to your getting to know the school. So it may give you a sense that the culture of the school really isn't a school that's going to put accessibility high up on their priority list. So those are the types of things that you might want to think about. And we can have conversations, more detailed conversations about the types of questions that you might want to ask. There's lots of different programs that exist at school. So that's another thing you want to think about. Is there a built-in program that is sort of built into the structure of the school? So for example, writing centers, tutoring, things like that, that's built into the cost of the program? Or is it a separate fee program, which might be sort of serving higher needs students? And sometimes it's a hybrid type program that schools have. So there's a built-in program, but then you can transition to more support services if that's what you need. So there's all different types of things out there. And that's really where you're going to find that information, by starting with your website review, talking to accessibility offices, talking to the school itself and finding that information, and then sort of matching that to all of that information that Janine was talking about before, your students' strengths and your students' needs, and sort of figuring out what's going to be the best fit for your student. Some other things that you might want to think about as you're beginning those conversations are you going to be looking for housing considerations? And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute when I talk about accommodations versus modifications. But if you're thinking about housing considerations, that's a conversation that you want to have early on. If your student's going to need a single room, either for mental health considerations or for medical considerations, you definitely want to have that conversation with the school and find out what the availability is of those types of situations. Some schools have very limited single rooms and some schools have many more available to them. And something to keep in mind is just because your student has that accommodation on their paperwork does not guarantee that they will get that accommodation met if it's a school that has very limited single rooms. So it's something to think about in terms of asking those questions. Really important. Talk to current students. That's important whether you're talking about a student with a disability or not. Talk to current students. What's the vibe of the campus? What's the culture of the campus? Is it a place where your student's going to feel comfortable? Are they going to thrive? Is it the kind of place that's just going to like feel good for them? Does it feel right? That's really, we can't emphasize that enough. As Janine said in the beginning, we really emphasize the idea of the best fit for your student, the right fit for your student, not the best school. There's no such thing as the best school. It's the best school for your student. And that's what we really want you to think about. And visiting campuses, of course, is very important. That's changed a lot during COVID. So there's lots of online tours and things like that that exist. But if at all possible, we really recommend taking a tour of the campus, getting that sense in person if you can. Something also to think about is the idea of larger schools versus small schools. There is a sense that larger schools may have more resources available to them, but the flip side of that is that smaller schools often have a smaller student to faculty ratio. So these are things to think about and balance out when you're thinking about sort of what's that best fit. There are very different things that may be the things that most meet the need of your student. So you really want to think about, again, those assets, those strengths, and the needs of your student as you sort of think about this beginning search of looking at all different schools. Next slide, please. So before we go any further, I want to explain what Janine touched on in the beginning with this idea of modifications versus accommodations. And this is something important to understand as we transition from that K-12 world to higher education, because it becomes very different in terms of the laws that guide the accommodations process in higher education and what supports your student might be eligible for. Modifications change what is learned and therefore change the content of the grade-specific curriculum. So students who have an IEP may have modifications to the curriculum in K-12. An accommodation is a change that helps a student learn, change how things are learned. So accommodations are typically grouped into 4 categories: the presentation, response, and setting and timing. Accommodations are what we see in higher education. There are no modifications to curriculum in higher education. And I'll explain why in a minute, because it has to do with what laws govern how we look for accommodations in higher education. But again, as Janine mentioned earlier, if your student has a large number of modifications on their IEP, it's important to phase those out in high school if your student is considering college, because there will be no modifications granted to your student in higher education. That's just not something that will be granted unless you're looking at a school that is a school that fully provides an all-inclusive program of support for your student. And those are schools that might provide a more intense program. So that's just something to think about in terms of the specificity of the needs of your student. I want to also take a minute to talk about this concept of unreasonable accommodations. It's important to understand that the accommodations that your student has had in high school, which are dictated either by their 504 plan or their IEP and have been agreed upon by a team, it's a very different process when you get to higher education. So you bring the information, the paperwork, and the documentation that Janine mentioned to the accessibility office. And the accessibility office may grant the types of accommodations that your student needs, but it is still up to the faculty member teaching each class to determine meeting the needs of those accommodations, because they can decide if an accommodation meets the needs or changes an essential component of the program or the course of study in their course. And what that means is, if, for example, a professor is teaching a course that has specific licensing requirements or accreditation requirements, a faculty member can say, I can't grant that accommodation because I need to strictly adhere to the licensing requirements or the accreditation requirements in this course. This happens a lot in STEM courses. So for example, in nursing courses or engineering courses, we see this often, where we need to work with the faculty and really clearly have conversations about the accreditation requirements and what the accommodation is. And there's much more awareness about this in the last sort of 5 years. For many years, though, it was quite a bit of a challenge to have some of these STEM courses and the faculty really understand the idea of the accommodation and how it did not change these sort of accreditation and licensing requirements. And for many of those areas of study, there's been much more awareness. And so the actual licensing exams now allow for accommodations. For example, the NCLEX exam, which is the licensing exam for nursing, now allows for extended time. And so because of that allowance, that means that students in nursing classes can now have extended time in any of their classes for their exams. But prior to that allowance for the licensing exam, most nursing classes would not allow for extended time on any of their tests in their classes. So as there's been more awareness in these fields and more changes in the licensing and accreditation requirements, that's allowed for more accommodations for students in the actual courses. So it's just important to ask these questions and understand this if you have a student that's interested in going into any of these specific fields that have licensing exams, because it will be very specific which types of accommodations can be met in those courses. But again, the key to remember here is that it's only accommodations, and I will be outlining some of those specific accommodations in a few minutes that you will see in higher education. Next slide, please. This is just a graphic, and hopefully you all can see it, that sort of clearly indicates some of those differences again. And just a reminder, modifications are what you would see under IDEA. In higher education, all of our student needs are met under ADA and 504. The major differences between these laws is that IDA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is what we consider to be an education law. In sort of contrast, the Americans with Disabilities Acts in Section 504 of the Rehab Act are what we consider civil rights laws. So you sort of transfer when you go into higher education to having your accommodations being met and sort of protected under civil rights laws versus specific education laws. Next slide, please. Again, this is just to sort of clarify and specify for those of you who might be interested in some of the details of the sort of change in what laws will sort of guide the protections of your students. So as you can see, this just outlines the specific sort of wording that protects your student. So Section 504 protects your student, as well as Title II and Title III of the ADA. What's important to note is these aren't just specific to education. These protections are over a large sort of bracket of areas, and that's why these are civil rights laws. So they protect your student in a variety of different settings. And so they were specifically designed to, in fact, Section 504 was actually not meant originally to apply to education, but has long been used to apply to protections in education settings. But these are the laws that protect your students and provide for accommodations in the higher education setting. Next slide, please. One of the other things that's important to understand is how we teach in higher education. And those of you that spent time in a higher education setting will remember that you probably had a professor who was an older curmudgeon-y type of professor that had been teaching the same course for probably 30, 40 years and had his or her way of teaching the class and was sort of infamous on campus for teaching it that way and not changing it, and might have even taught your parents the same course that way. And there are still those faculty members on campuses. Part of the problem with that is that the way faculty in higher education are sort of selected to teach is by their expertise in their discipline. For example, my PhD is in public health. I don't have any training per se in teaching until I got very interested in the concept of accessibility and disability and took a lot of professional development courses in actually teaching and access to information and universal design. That has become sort of a switch in the last decade, where there's been really an interest in working with faculty in higher education on training them to become better teachers. So many college campuses, you will see things like Centers for Teaching Excellence, Centers for Academic Excellence, they all have different names, but it's really a push to work with faculty to make them better teachers, because they're experts in their field and their discipline, but they never were actually trained to teach. And so part of that means that when a student comes to them and presents information on an accommodation, they don't necessarily know what that is. They don't necessarily know how to meet that. And as we've become more aware of how to become better teachers in higher education, there's become a real push to have higher education faculty understand this concept of universal design. And the slide that's now up is really this sort of graphic of the functional definition of accessibility, which helps us to really think about this concept of universal design. The definition of universal design for learning being that it's a framework that guides the development of flexible learning environments so that it can accommodate all learning. It's what we consider best practices, and it allows for a greater opportunity for learning to fully demonstrate knowledge, and actually reduces the need for individual accommodations. As you see on the graphic, the idea is that it allows for students to acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, enjoy the same services as students without disabilities. So the idea is that we create our courses and we design our courses so that everyone can access the information equally, and therefore we may not need to provide as many accommodations for our students. I'm sure many of you are asking, how does this actually work? What's an example of this? So the example I use most often is the idea of multiple choice testing. So whereas in the past, many faculty, for example, in the history departments or in the STEM areas, would provide long tests of multiple choice options where students just needed to memorize the information and almost sort of regurgitate it back, which is not necessarily something that many of our students with learning differences were very good at. We've sort of flipped the switch, and we now really encourage faculty to think about alternative assessment formats, group work, different sort of creative alternative assessment formats. One of the ways that I explain this, because I work a lot with faculty on these sort of training formats and working with them to help understand sort of why they should look at other sort of formats. And the best way I can explain that is I say to my colleagues, if a student comes back into your office in 5 years, what do you want them to tell you about the class? What do you want them to remember? Because it really, students just memorizing information and regurgitating it back is not necessarily learning the information. So we're sort of flipping how we want faculty to learn. And this is actually what will help all of our students, including our students with disabilities. So this idea of universal design is something that you will see on many campuses in training for faculty. Another thing you might want to ask when you go to the accessibility office or you're touring on campus is, what about the Centers for Teaching Excellence? Do you have that? Are your faculty being trained in universal design? Is this something that is going on? Are there syllabuses that are used as models for universal design? Next slide. So Janine tells me that this is one of her other favorite slides in our presentation. So it's not very graphically beautiful, but it does hold a lot of good information. So I'll walk you through this. We did say that we would talk about common accommodations in higher education. And as someone who's been teaching for over 15 years in higher education, I have seen sort of the change in what students typically get for accommodations and how this process works. So I will tell you that this list is pretty much what I see commonly among students today. And these are the types of accommodations that you can sort of assume you will have less difficulty getting for your student. So if these are the types of things that your student would help support your student, that are currently the types of things that are on a 504 plan or an IEP, you can rest assured that these are probably things that you will be able to successfully achieve in terms of getting support for your student in college. There's no guarantee, however, so you should know that you're going to go meet with the accessibility office, provide the documentation that Janine mentioned, and make sure that these are the types of things that would support your student. Again, as I mentioned, it's up to the faculty discretion, right? So you want to make sure that they would work in the courses they were taking. But as you can see, one of the first ones we mentioned is a note taker. Janine did talk about the importance of learning to take notes, and it's really important for the student to be taking notes themselves. But most universities will provide the opportunity for a note taker to be a note taker to be provided in class. Just so you are aware, that note taker is another student. It's not a professional or a professor providing notes. It's another student that's in the course. So you do want to be aware of that. This can be very helpful for our students with language processing issues like dysgraphia, dyslexia, ADHD, some of our students with medical needs. Extended time for assignments or tests is also a pretty common accommodation that we see. Alternative location for testing, for example, taking tests in a testing center so that there's less distractions. Assistive technology is very commonly seen. A text reader app is, I've seen many students with that. Closed captioning, which we mentioned earlier, making sure that PowerPoint slides, et cetera, have closed captioning for our students that need that. Alternative text formats, it's you can often request large print textbooks. Writing support, that's something that many students need. I just got finished teaching an intensive graduate student course, and I can tell you that almost all my graduate students also needed writing support. So it's really something that we still see many of our students needing. And most universities have a writing center. So that's something that is commonly used as a support. On the other hand, there are a number of accommodations that might need additional documentation or review by either a committee, an administrator, a dean's office. So being aware of the fact that those are things that you might need a little more time or a little more documentation in order to receive those accommodations. Housing is one in particular that I like to point out. And in COVID, it's become really important to understand the difficulties with getting single room housing. So in the past, we've seen how single room housing needed for students with medical needs, as well as some mental health needs, particularly around anxiety. Students who have any type of respiratory illness have sort of gone to the top of the priority list for single room housing in the last 2 years because of COVID. So just something to keep in mind if your student is going to be applying for single room housing, what exactly the criteria is, and knowing how many single room housing options there are available at the campus that you're looking at. If your student has anxiety, perhaps living closer to home and going to a commuter school may be the better solution if they need a single room in the beginning of their college process, if they're not going to find a school that would be able to guarantee them a single room. Flexible schedule, decreased course load is another one, and priority registration. Those are some of the examples of ones that sometimes need a little bit more documentation. Something else to be aware of is your student will have all of their coursework provided through different platforms. So while they may be using Google type platforms in high school, most universities use either something called Canvas or Blackboard. There's lots of different accessibility options that can be embedded within those particular platforms. So that's something to be aware of. There's a particular add-on called Blackboard Ally. It can actually be added onto Canvas as well that can help and assist with accessibility. Something else to also note is whether the accessibility office itself has database and portals that help streamline the systems. The two sort of more commonly used systems are AIM, the Accessible Information Management System, and Clockwork. So again, those are the types of questions when you're meeting with an office or asking them, you might want to ask, just so you get a sense of how many staff are in the office, what types of systems they have, what types of supports they have, and how widely across the university these types of systems exist in terms of supporting the students. Next slide. Just to emphasize some of what I said, under federal law, faculty are responsible for making their courses and course content accessible, but they're not required to change the essential content of their courses. And the essential content is up to the discretion of the faculty. This is where that idea of self-advocacy is really important. Communication between the student and faculty is critical to ensure the successful implementation of accommodations. Janine mentioned this before, but this is where, as a parent, it's not going to be helpful if you pick up the phone and call the faculty member and say, why aren't you giving my student the accommodations that they need? That actually will upset a large number of faculty members. They won't respond favorably to that. It won't help your student. Those calls usually get punted up to higher level administrators. I will tell you, I've had a large number of calls over the years from parents. And first of all, without FERPA, you're not allowed to talk to the parent, and it can cause all sorts of issues. So I do not recommend, as a parent, calling the faculty member, but rather having the student directly work with the faculty member to try to figure out how they can make the course more accessible, or to work with the accessibility office to be that conduit to help them talk to the faculty member. And an example of this type of work that might be concerning, again, going back to STEM courses, oftentimes students have an accommodation of formulas on a note card. This can be challenging, let's say for a biology course or a chemistry course, where the faculty member says, well, for my students who are nursing students or engineering students, they need to have these formula memorized for their licensing exams. However, if your student's not in those programs, that might be the argument, well, they're not going to be taking a licensing exam, so why do they have to have those formula memorized? So there are workarounds. It's just a matter of having those conversations and the dialogue and the student advocating. Next slide, please. One thing I did want to point out, again, the faculty academic freedom, which I've talked about, but for those of you who have students who have physical disabilities, being aware of the fact that many of our universities are beautiful campuses with old buildings, and there are architectural limitations of access. For any of those landmark buildings, it may be an issue in terms of accessibility, physical accessibility, ramps, et cetera, and being aware that code is just a baseline. So sometimes our ramps are too steep for accessibility, too narrow for accessibility, and things like that. So again, an actual physical visit to the campus can be very important to understand whether or not those things will be able to meet our students' needs. Also, many campuses, newer buildings have Braille in the elevators, have Braille signs throughout the buildings, but older buildings do not. So again, these are the types of information and questions you want to ask in your conversations and you want to look out for when you do your visits. Next slide, please. So I know that we've said a lot in this presentation, and we're coming to the end of our formal part of the presentation, and we'll be open to questions. We did this really to provide sort of an overview of as much information as we could in this hour. We know that there's so much information, so we wanted to sort of help you get through the sort of planning process. We wanted to sort of be able to give you a guide on how to be prepared to make the process go more smoothly. We wanted you to sort of understand the basic paperwork, keeping track of the forms and helping transition your student to get you ready for that part where you'll be packing your student up to send them off to college or to a transition program, whatever seems to be the most appropriate for your student. Have your tissues ready because it can certainly be an emotional journey. And then you'll be ready to take that time to visit them in the fall, the Parents' Weekend, where you'll be seeing your student thrive at whatever program or university you found that was the best fit for your student. Next slide. The next two slides are helpful resources that we have collected for you. This is a link to a number of different resources that we've collected that we utilize, that some of our colleagues have recommended and utilized. One of the things to just add on to this, as I mentioned, I do a lot of work additionally, not just the work that Janine and I do with family members, but I also do a lot of work with faculty training. So additional resources that we utilize are things like the Association for Higher Ed and Disability. And so we sort of use that work in addition, and we think about sort of like how faculty are being trained and working on that piece as well. So we're doing sort of both sides of this work. And here are some books that we've also added in that we recommend that as helpful resources. We want to take a moment at the end of this presentation to just remind everyone to take a deep breath. There's a lot of information. There's a lot to process here. There's a lot of challenges when you are raising a child with any type of disability or need. And we know that we're both parents of children who have needs. And so the blessing of COVID, as Janine said, is these extended timelines. So, you know, there's many options, there's many paths, whether it's college or a gap year or transition programs. Just, you know, sort of go through this process thinking about what is going to be the best fit for your student. There's no, you know, answer across the board that's the same answer for everyone. So please sort of keep that in mind as you sort of think about what is the right answer for your child and your family, and don't worry about what, you know, your neighbor's doing and the best friend is doing and all of that. Just focus on what's going to be the right answer for your child and your family. We want to especially thank SpedNet Wilton, the Wilton Public Schools, the Wilton Library, and Newtown Sped PTA for their partnership in inviting us to give this presentation. We appreciate their support. We have given really a brief overview today of lots of information, as much as we could stuff into an hour. And there's so much more that we could talk about. So we would be happy to answer questions now. And we're also happy to speak in depth with anyone who would like some more information. And we have posted here our general information for our website for College Access and Beyond, as well as our direct emails if you would like to reach out to either of us, but we will now take questions.
Thanks. That was terrific. I wanted everybody to know, because there have been a number of questions. Yes, we will be sending out the video of this recording as we do for all of our recordings. And that'll be sometime probably tomorrow. Also, there are a number of college essays on our website. My son, Janine's son, and a number of other kids who have written college essays that talk about their struggle in high school and how they've succeeded, and they might be just very helpful and hopeful for you as you go through this process. Okay, we've got a lot of questions. To confirm, colleges do not acknowledge IEPs, but our student can register with the Accessibility Office to set up accommodations for themselves. So I know you've talked about that, so just to clarify.
So absolutely not an IEP. You will start the process from the beginning again. You will register with the Office of Accessibility, bring your documentation, and they will determine what accommodations can be met. But it is, yes, no, your 504 and your IEP does not translate to college, so you will start from the beginning, and it will be under the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 that they will meet their accommodations in college.
Thank you. Next is, what is meant exactly by writing support?
So in higher education, there's a number of different options for writing support. One of them is that most universities have a writing center. And so that can run along a continuum of writing support. There can be peer tutors, there can be faculty members that provide writing support. There can also be an accommodation with writing support where you can request things like writing review before turning in papers. It really will depend, again, on your student's need and what is in their accommodation.
And again, some colleges actually, as part of their freshman required curriculum, now have freshman writing 101, how to write at the college level as part of their curriculum. And that's available to all students.
What about emotional support animals?
What about emotional support? What was the end of that?
Animals. Emotional support animals. We've never had that question before.
So that, again, is an accommodation that is met at the university level, and by law, universities are required to meet that need as long as it can be met safely within the dorm living requirements.
If your student has not had testing through their high school within 2 years prior to college, what type of professional will the accessibility offices accept documentation of their disability from?
So that very much depends on what the student's disability is. Again, if it's a medical disability, it would have to be a treating physician, and Deborah can speak a little bit more about that. If it is a learning disability, a psychologist, neuropsychologist can perform an evaluation of the student and write up a report so that the student can take that report on with them to college.
One of the things I recommend is looking at the website of colleges that you're interested in. They often will list who they will accept referrals and documentation from.
Thank you. Should students or parents interact with the accessibility office to sort out potential fit? Per the comments about faculty getting upset with any parent involvement.
Once the student is enrolled, no. I recommend parents do an initial conversation with the accessibility office prior to enrollment to do that sort of assessment if it's going to be the right fit. But after that, really every conversation should be with a student, unless you get to a point where the student is unable to be successful in resolving it, and it needs to go to a higher level of administration. And even at that point, I really recommend that students parents stay out of it if at all possible. Students should be able to navigate it through the accessibility office, through an administrator, getting a dean involved. It's really not considered beneficial for the parents to be involved. And again, as we mentioned, there are actual legal requirements that keep parents out of the conversation. I've had students walk into my office with parents on a cell phone, parents screaming, this has to be addressed, this has to be addressed. And, I can't talk to the parent without the documentation that I'm allowed to talk to the parent. So, I understand it's frustrating. A lot of parents have the perspective, I'm paying for this, almost like a commodity type thing. I'm paying for this education. I have the right to know these things, but your child's 18 and they're an adult. And so really it's their right and their responsibility to solve it.
And another thing to consider, Deb, too, is that meeting with accessibility during the application process is really a good chance for the student to actually practice advocating for themselves with the parent there as well. But if you're going to do that, make sure that your student is prepared to talk on their own, because very often the accessibility person who is meeting with your student is really going to be looking to your student for the answers and for the explanations, and really not to you. You can be there more to kind of shepherd them and maybe add to the conversation, but I think the accessibility staff in general are going to want to hear from the student.
Absolutely. And they will be looking, depending also on the age your student is at when those conversations happen. If your student is under 18, you can be a part of those, but your student is over 18, absolutely, by law, it's up to your student if you're a part of those conversations.
Okay, next, for those of you looking for the presentation and the information and resources on our website, it's right now under recent presentations. And anyone who wants it, I'm happy to send it to them. Sorry. Can you give some examples of college transition programs, especially if you know of any in Massachusetts?
I think the answer to that is we'd probably want to talk more about what your students' needs are, because there's so many different schools with different types of programs. So that's probably a one-on-one conversation. But the answer is there are a variety of different transition programs at a variety of different places. It really just depends on what your students' needs are.
So feel free to reach out. Oh, also, and on the website, there's, I think there are 2 or 3 under the resources books that talk about specific colleges that are helpful, very helpful, as far as being more supportive than others for kids with different types of learning disabilities. So you can access them there as well.
And
I would add also that it's changing rapidly, that there are more and more schools offering different programs and changing programs. And so it's a conversation that sort of, happens in real time, because we're even learning about, we just had a conversation the other day about a school and a program that we both just learned about that we didn't know about before. So it's a really sort of ever-changing process, which is the good news, that there are more and more schools opening more and more programs, becoming more and more aware of accessibility.
And SpedNet also did a presentation on this too, that they can look for on our website.
Which one? The transition programs? Okay. Can you please show the slide with book recommendations one more time?
I have read every single one of these. They're extremely helpful. And this KW Guide to Colleges for Students with Learning Differences, 15th edition, that's the most recent edition. That is the book that we use to help families sort of find the right fit. It gives really great explanations of the different colleges that are out there, the different supportive levels, and just descriptions overall of the colleges. So that's a very useful tool.
A number of these authors also have websites, so they have updated information on their websites.
And just to repeat the colleges that are going to be available on the 22nd at the next presentation, our next webinar is University of Maryland, Hobart and William Smith College, Sacred Heart, Hofstra, and College Steps. Next question. So if colleges do not recognize IEPs, will they accept a foreign language exemption on an IEP as why the student didn't take the foreign language in high school? Meaning, will it be acceptable for colleges that usually require a foreign language for admission? That's a good question.
So it's if the student is allowed to graduate from high school without the foreign language requirement, that's the graduation requirement. There's multiple pieces to this, right? So they can graduate without it. But if the college requires it it's not usually to apply, it's usually they will need to then take it as part of their course of study. So there's a couple of different pieces of that, right? So as long as the school and the state has certified that the student can graduate from high school without the language requirement, then they graduate and they can go on to the next phase of their career. So they are graduating. But in order to get an exemption to not have to take a language in college, that's a whole different process, and you're gonna have to go through that process again. So what I recommend is do your research and look for colleges that don't have a language requirement, because you are much more likely to find that than to find a school that will let you get out of the language requirement. Schools that have a core requirement and a language requirement are not likely to allow for you to get out of that.
You know,
And in my
Also
experience,
similar with
lot
a
of-
math requirement.
Yeah, and in my experience, a lot of those schools are the liberal arts type schools that require that language requirement.
But you will see today more flexibility. You'll see liberal arts colleges with an open curriculum. You will also see something to be aware of, that schools, universities have different requirements across the different schools and colleges within them. So do your research carefully, because you can be in, one of the specific schools. You can be in the environmental studies school, you could be in the engineering school and not have a language requirement, but be aware if your student switches majors and goes into the College of Arts and Sciences, then they would have likely to have a language requirement. So it is something to be very aware of how that plays itself out. But if the school has certified that they, in their IEP, that they can graduate without that language requirement, then they're graduating, and that's fine. And that would just be written in that special section of any such special circumstances on their common application, or whichever application format they're using.
I know that my child, my grown son, didn't take language in high school, and when he went to college, he could either take sign language or the culture of a country. They had many different options of ways to make up that language requirement.
I was just going to say that a lot of high schools and colleges are both offering that as a language credit.
Absolutely. Sign language has become a very common language credit at schools. But it's important to ask the question, because there are some schools that don't, and there are schools also that don't count it. So if your student has taken sign language in high school and was thinking, okay, that's fine, that's just what I'll continue as my language in college, if the college doesn't offer it, then they won't be able to, or if they don't count it. So these are important. You need to be very specific in the questions you ask. And that's the type of stuff that, again, that to look on the college website and carefully look at the programs of study and requirements. And also to know that your student is bound by the rules of the program of study of the year they come in on. So don't look at the 2016 program of studies, look at the program of study for the year that they will come in on.
That's a great point.
Okay, a number of people are asking for a copy of the presentation. It will be on our website tomorrow under recent presentations, and along with other things, and we will be sending it out. There's also a really good book I give to students launching off to college called College Rules: How to Study, Survive, and Succeed in College, on Amazon. It's a short and sweet, and even high schoolers are willing to read the bulleted points at the end of each chapters. This is from a psychologist who's writing.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks for the resource.
I missed the books and websites again. Yes, we will send out the books and websites to everybody. One of the most common accommodations my students get, this is from a professor, is advance receipt of PowerPoints or handouts. As a result, I now post these materials to the learning management system early, if and only if I have a student in my current semester course with such an accommodation. The two most common are extended time for tests and distraction-reduced environments.
That's great. And actually also as another gift of COVID, a lot of professors are now video recording their webinars and posting them so that the students can go back if they missed a class or if they were sick, or they can just go back at their leisure and review the lecture, which is a really good tool. And it's offered to all students, but it helps students with disabilities.
I would also say kudos to that professor. Thank you for posting your PowerPoints. There are faculty that, again, due to academic freedom, do not agree to post their PowerPoints because that is their individual work. And so that's another piece of the information that those of us that are working in higher ed to sort of educate faculty about this are working to help them to understand how important that is to students. So I appreciate faculty that are willing to do that because it does make such a huge difference. It's similar to a note taker for students who have the slides ahead of time. It can make a huge difference.
Does a student who uses a CPAP get a single room? I will say that my son does, and he did get a single room, but I guess it depends on how many.
Again, it depends on the school.
are
You know,
available.
there are universities that have entire dorms of single rooms, and there are universities that have 10 single rooms available. So these are important questions to ask, you know, how many single rooms exist on this campus? Because, you know, if you're hoping for a single room, you really need to know physically how many rooms exist, because that it's literally a number of beds. Then they start prioritizing. So you don't know if your child will get it until you have a sense of how many are available and then weighing the odds in terms of the priorities.
What about social emotional support? Any thoughts on how to select a college that might be better at providing non-academic emotional support to students?
So for the students I've had that have struggled in that area, one of the things that I've always suggested is getting involved in clubs and different environments. And so one of what I would recommend is when you're looking at schools, making sure that there are areas of interest that your student aligned with your student's interest. So if it's a school that has 75% involved in Greek life, and that's not going to work for your student because of social emotional struggles, or it's just not their area of interest, that's not going to be the right kind of school, right? So really looking at things that are on campus that are going to align with being supportive for your student. The other thing is to look at how they structure their support through their psychological services programs and things like that. There's lots of ways to sort of assess that. Is it built within health services? Is it a separate organization? Is it way off campus? Is it right on campus? How many support meetings can students have? Do they have group programs? Do they have online support programs? I mean, there's lots of ways you can sort of assess that and see, again, what is the culture of the school and how do they have programs that work, that really sort of pull students in, or is it sort of a stigma on the campus? So those are, again, important questions to ask.
And a lot of schools have actually beefed up their health and wellness centers and now offer short-term counseling for students if they're running into trouble. So that may be something you want to look into. And also, if your student currently has somebody that they work with on social emotional issues, they can continue to see that person via telehealth or via Zoom once they go to college. And then again, another gift of COVID. So that's another thing to consider.
Most universities have also worked extensively with faculty in training to do early alerts and highlights. So it's one of the things that we do. You'll see most schools, and again, this is something you'll see on websites and things like that, if they have a Navigate or a Starfish system where faculty are encouraged to alert academic deans and student life deans. So we're alerting not just if there's missing work and things like that, but is, you know, are you concerned about the student? Do they seem like they're engaged? Do they seem like they're not engaged? And there's lots of different ways we can send those alerts. So there's really been a push to make sure that faculty are also a part of this process. And some of the categories are even just like I'm just worried about this kid. Like, I just don't feel like they're fitting in, getting the support they need. And so there's just an opportunity. There's so many different ways now that faculty members and other staff members are involved in that process of just helping identify students, so that there's lots of different ways to connect students to the support they need.
Last question I have here is, what colleges offer good support for LD students? So
that's very much dependent on the particular student. So it might be better to just address that question individual if they want to shoot us an email.
right. Plus, as I said, as we said, there are many resources that address that very specific question online on our website. It's under college planning resources on the info page, which is now under recent presentations for this presentation. Tomorrow or later today, we will be sending out the recording of this conversation, as well as a number of webinars that are addressing the transition to college issue and self-advocacy skills and the like. We will also have the books and websites and the PowerPoint and a summary of the presentation and info about the speakers.
Eve, did you mention Mary Murphy at the end of the month? She's going to be talking specifically about executive function. Oh, okay.
Yes, on the date is March 30th. Dr. Mary Murphy will be doing executive function skills your teens need before graduating from high school from 11 to noon. I guess it's 11 to noon instead of 10 to noon. Mary, you're there? Let me know. As a webinar about specifically about executive function skills, which will be extremely helpful. Any more questions? That was a lot of questions. Thank you guys for, yes, 11 o'clock, Mary says. Okay, thank you. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. That was extremely helpful. We got many thank yous on both in the chat and the Q&As, and especially from some folks who said they had never, oops, there are two more. Thank you, thank you. There you go.
Thank you so much, Eve, for having us. There was so much to say. We tried to condense it all, and any questions that they may think of later, just shoot us an email. It's fine.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us. And as Janine said, we're happy to answer questions via email. So feel free to reach out.
Right. And if anyone has any questions, I mean, everybody should know that you can always write us at info@sped.wilton.org. We will either answer the question or send it on to a speaker or give you options of people who we think might be helpful for you. So thank you all very much. Thanks, Janine and Deborah. That was awesome.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
That was great.